everyone. Today is iFormBuilder 101 training webinar on the art of form building. My name is Kevin Ellison, and I will be your host for today's session. The presenter will be Barretts Introduction. As Barrett goes through the webinar, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have, as well as bring them to the attention of Barrett. So if this is the first iFormBuilder webinar you're attending, welcome to you all. In the 48 hours after today's session, we'll be sending out an email with today's recorded session and additional resources. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Barrett, and she will get started.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's training webinar on iFormBuilder 101, the art of form building. For those of you who are brand new, as Kevin mentioned, my name is Barretts Introduction, and I've been a solutions engineer here at Zerion Software for a little over 3 years. And what I get to focus on and do is on the training side of our iFormBuilder platform, as well as our upcoming platform called Gnosis. So I have this awesome opportunity to work with a lot of customers to make sure that they are up to speed on the platform. So that's just a little quick background on me. I also want to go through some of the different iFormBuilder support channels we have available to you. And this is extremely valuable for those individuals who are coming to iFormBuilder and aren't yet users. So the first one is we have an awesome Customer Success Center. And I'll just jump over there. In this Customer Success Center, we start at the very top, and you'll notice that we have different topics. So we have Gnosis, iFormBuilder, iOS, Android, Community, and the iFormBuilder Academy. You can always come in here and search for a specific topic or search for something. Maybe you're wanting to learn more JavaScript for iFormBuilder. So we have a couple different knowledge-based articles on that. So that's a great function, but we also have these awesome iFormBuilder agents that are on the chat section, this bottom right-hand corner. They're on almost 24 hours, 5 days a week. So they are happy to assist you. If you're looking for a specific article and you can't find it, then feel free to go into that chat and ask them, and they'll be there to help. You'll also notice right now we have our iFormBuilder feature frenzy. And this is just happening now, and it goes to the beginning of June. And what we're asking of you is that we want you to come in here and give us some of your new ideas and feature requests that you have for the iFormBuilder platform. 8 of the features, if they get to the top, will then be entered into the July battle, and whichever is the winner will then be added to the platform. So be sure to check this out and come visit it if you have some time later on today. Before we even go any further with this, if you do want to participate in this feature frenzy and you want to make sure that you're able to follow and see what's going on with this, then you'll want to create an account within our iFormBuilder Zerion Software Customer Success Center. And the way that you do that is by going up to the top corner and clicking the sign in button, which seems counterintuitive if you don't have a username yet. But you will go there, and at that point, at the very bottom of the window, you'll see where you can sign up to become a member of the iFormBuilder Help Desk. Once I sign in, that's when I then have the option to follow this article. So I want to know every time new posts come in or anytime new posts and comments. By following this, then I'll receive an email every time there's been a change. So I strongly suggest doing that, not just for the feature frenzy, but also for some of our other articles that we have, like for our release notes. If you're somebody who is just getting your feet wet with iFormBuilder, we have a relatively large amount of releases that happen throughout the year. Our team is really, really busy. So one thing that you can do is if you go into the release notes section of our topic of the Customer Success Center, then you'll see a list of all the releases that we've had, but you'll also be able to follow this conversation or these posts so that every time a new release is coming, you are notified about it. So it's extremely valuable in that way as well. Besides the release notes, we do have some training opportunities within the iFormBuilder Academy. And the community forum is for the one portion of our community forum is that feature frenzy that we just started today. If you're new and you're looking to have some support for your project, then we do offer project services, and we are happy to assist you and talk through your project and see what might be a best fit for you. The live webinars, clearly you know about those since you're joining us today, but if you didn't know, each webinar is recorded, and then we have a training webinar page where you can go and see all the past recorded sessions and maybe even download some of the materials from those sessions and listen to them. Also, with the live webinars page, we have all of our upcoming webinars so that you can go in and see what special topics we're discussing soon, as well as any of the reoccurring training webinars that we have scheduled for this year. Then we have our Form Builder certification. Now, this has been extremely valuable this past year, and we now have over 100 individuals that have been Form Builder certified. And with that certification, it's two 4-hour sessions. And let's say we have the first one on a Tuesday, the next one will be on a Thursday. And with those 4-hour sessions, you are required to meet specifications for a project so that you then to be able to receive that certificate, you have to complete those projects in the entirety. The reason we have those projects and the reason we put so much effort into this certification is as larger enterprises start building projects with iFormBuilder, we want to make sure that they have people on their team that know the best practices and that they can trust. And that's where the Form Builder certification really comes into play. We also have a tip or a tool called Show Me How, and this is in our current platform. When you log into iFormBuilder, at the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see where it says Show Me How. And let me just jump into one of the other pages to show you how that functions and how it appears. So on this particular page, while I'm in the Form Builder, I have the button that says Show Me How in the bottom left. If I click that button, then I have two sections, the How to Get Started and the Help. In the How to Get Started, these are different processes that we've mapped out that we see as a strong value for individuals who are just getting started with iFormBuilder and want to learn some of the basics. Under the Help section, we have all those processes, but we have additional processes that you may be searching for on tips on how to do. So let's jump in here and talk about the initial project considerations. And these are extremely valuable for those individuals who are just starting with your project now. The first one is, what devices will the end users have access to? So are your users going to be using either an Android phone, Android tablet, an Apple iOS phone, or iPad or iPod? There are different options, and it's really important that you start thinking about what devices they will be using to use iForm. Now, for those of you who are brand new, you may not be aware, iForm is configured to be used on both Android and iOS only. So the next project consideration we have is, what naming convention do you use for this form and for the option list? So naming conventions can be extremely valuable, and in just a second, I'm going to show you a screenshot of where you're able to change those naming conventions and actually configure them. The reason they help you is not only for when it comes to having the same name for forms across your different account, but also when it comes to assigning forms, it's much easier if you've developed some sort of naming convention, and I have a suggestion on that as well. The next project consideration is, how do you structure the form? So when you're just getting started, a lot of times you're taking that paper form and you're transforming that paper form into digital. Now, iForm allows you to do so much more than just taking those questions and moving it over. We allow you to do validation, so the user can't submit a record until they meet a specific type of validation. You're able to add required fields. You're able to standardize how that data appears. So it's really important when you're starting your initial project that you almost map out how you want this project to appear. A lot of times when I have new projects, I take that paper form and I really start writing on it, and I start saying what different element input types I'm going to use, as well as when I'm going to use subforms. The next, or actually the last project consideration is, how do you add, or where can you add form functionality to cut down on human error and the post data collection process. So I'm not sure how many of you are currently taking data and taking it from the paper form or maybe a different form altogether and then having to type all that information into an Excel doc. And there's spelling errors and maybe they put in the totally different, wrong kind of input altogether. So by adding form functionality, then you're able to cut down on that post-data cleansing process. And if that's something that you're interested in learning more about, our next session at the end of June will be going on how to create smart forms and adding some of that form functionality. So the next
Hey Barrett, if I could jump in and interrupt you, I did have a question come through on the chat window here, and the question was, is iFormBuilder only functional across Android and iOS?
So yes, iForm is designed for Android and iOS devices. Now, when it comes to building your forms and building your project, that's all done on the web portal. So in just a few minutes, I'll be logging into iFormBuilder, my iFormBuilder account on my computer, and I'll be able to show you how that looks. Now, for those individuals who may have used or may be using Microsoft tablets or Microsoft, I know that Microsoft at least a year ago had talked about making it easier so that Android apps are available on those Microsoft surfaces or whatever they may be. And so eventually, once they open that up a little bit, then I'm sure you'll be able to see iForm there as well. There is a tool that can emulate an Android device, and that's called BlueStacks. And that can be used on a computer or those Microsoft tablets. So you can still use iForm in the Microsoft world, but you just have to do an extra step. So it's kind of like a workaround. Kevin, let me know if there are any questions after that or any follow-up questions.
Sure, you bet.
Thank you very much. Now, this next tip is kind of silly to point out, but when it comes to using our different tools and our different support options, even in our Customer Success Center articles, we're trying to have this consistency on what we call what a user fills out in a form. Now, currently we call it a widget, an input type, an input, an element, and an element input type. So just to help you so that there's less confusion, if you see any of those texts or see any of those words in some of the help desk articles, they are all referring to the same thing, and that's just the type of question you're asking in your form. So as I mentioned, one of the best practices that we have here is using a naming convention. And for the naming convention that I use when I'm building my form is I'm going to start if I have a top layer. So let me take a step back. I keep saying this word subform, but I want to make sure that everyone understands what that is. Essentially, we have when you're in FormBuilder, you can create as many forms as you need to, depending on the account that you have. Now, when you're creating a form, you have the option to add an input type called a subform. Essentially, a subform is a separate form that you're attaching to another form. So we usually think of that as a parent-child relationship. So when it comes to our naming convention and seeing how those forms are tied together, that's where we need this. I always start each form with the same title. So the parent form name _P, and then if there's a subform attached, I would have the parent form name _subform, and then _C. So I'm able to see that relationship. If you look at the screenshot on the right-hand side, you'll notice that I was using child instead of C, and this was earlier on when I had just started building some of my forms, and what I found is by using child and parent spelling the whole thing out, I was actually creating a much longer table name than I wanted to, and so that's why I had changed my naming convention to be _P or _C. But what I love about this picture is you're able to see very quickly in the FormBuilder home all the forms that are connected, and they're all in the same area. When it comes to coming in and editing the table name to have this naming convention, that's done in the FormBuilder. So let me just jump over here. And I've actually already started this form, But if I come back here and I go to my Form Builder homepage, this is where I see all of the naming conventions and all the forms that are connected to each other. And if I go to my iFormBuilder IFB 101 May webinar, that's the one we're working on today, I can load this form. If I go to the Edit Form Properties section, this is where I'm able to uncheck this box that says Based on Label and add in the naming convention, so it's _P, so that I remember that this is the top layer of the form. If I were then to add a subform to this, then I would change the name at the end, but I would have the same beginning. And we'll go through that in a little bit more detail in just a second. Some of you may be wondering, how do we come up with this naming convention? Well, this has worked really well for the projects that I've done, but what I've seen other groups do is if they have multiple projects that may be happening in different countries, they start each form with the country code and then have the parent form name and _P at the end of that, and then the _C at the end of that. What other groups have found is it's helpful to have the person's initials who's creating that form at the very beginning, so that they're able to identify quickly the ones that they have built and have been able to apply it to those. The next best practice is to always make sure that you build for the device type. As I mentioned, iForm is available on Android and iOS devices, and so just to give you a quick background here, iFormBuilder originally was created to be just on iOS. Now, the last couple years, we realized how important it was to have iForm also on Android devices. So with that, we've been working, or the development team has been working to have it so that the iForm app on Android and on iOS functions very similarly. And if you've ever gone in and used both of them, they do have a very similar flow and a very similar interface. There are just some minor differences on how some of the different questions appear. And that's just because they are on different devices and different softwares or different systems. That being said, what you do need to be very aware of when you're building your project is that you know the differences for iOS and Android, because there are some functions that are only available on iOS currently. So if you were to add those to your forms, it'll be great for your iOS users, but not so much for the Android users. So what I have here in the PDF that I share with you, it'll give you the differences between iOS and Android. So it brings you to our article on the differences, so you can come in and as you build your form, you'll know which ones are applicable. And you'll notice a lot of them are available on both types of platforms.
Hey Barrett, before you dive into this, I did have a question come through the chat, and it says, what is the maximum number of characters for an element or a form? Is there any max to that? And is there any issues when exporting to Excel?
So there are maximum limits on the table names and how long each table name could be. And even if I were to come in here and try to just put in a bunch more letters here, and eventually you'll notice it just stops. So this is where my character limit comes into play for the table name. And for the data column names and the elements, when you're actually in the form, it does the same thing. So it will stop at the limit. And we do have articles on what those limits are in our help desk, and so I'd urge that person to go check that out. I think for this first one, let's see if I hover over it, if it tells me. Oh, 50 characters. So for the table name, that's limited to only 50. And for the data column names, I believe it's around 36, but we can definitely go in and check that out when we're in the form builder. When it comes to exporting the data, the reason we have the limits here is so that you don't have problems when you are exporting it. So there shouldn't be any issue when you're taking the data and going into Excel or whatever it may be. All right, thank you. The next is with our form building best practice is to make sure that you always build for the smallest device. So if you're using an iOS device and you're doing all your testing on an iPad, it may look beautiful. The select option list that you have may appear exactly how you want them to, and it just may be perfect. Now, if you were to then take that same form and view it in an iPhone, you may notice that some of the text is then cut off on some of our input types. So with the select option list and with the toggle, what does end up happening is you only have so much real estate on the different devices. So where it may look great and beautiful on the iPad, it will actually end up cutting off some of the text on the iPhone. So you want to make sure that if a user is going to have access to the smaller devices, that you're testing it on those so that all the text is legible and you're getting the data that you need from that. When you're using an Android device with the select option list and the toggle, it actually wraps the text. So the user will see all the letters, but it may be kind of hard to understand the way that it appears. So make sure that you've viewed it on both as well. Going forward with some of our best practices, we do suggest that you use subforms, especially if you have a larger form. One thing is that we recommend is to try to limit how many questions you have on that parent form, so that top level. If you have too many questions and you add too many smart controls, what could end up happening is it could, as the user tries to sync their device after they've collected data, they may reach a timeout limit. And that may be because the form is so large. And so what we suggest is to try to limit it so that you don't have more than 100 questions on that top layer, that parent form, and instead have more subforms throughout your project. So the subforms are great, again, because all the data that's collected in a subform is tied back to that parent form, but also because you're able to set it up so that it's a multi-link subform, which allows the user to take multiple records with no real limitation within those subforms. So I always have a photo subform, which allows the user to take as many photos as they need with no limitation from me, and so they're able to truly gather better data that way. And let me just jump out here. This is a great time to stop and kind of just show you what a form looks like, or what some of these different input types look like as well. Okay, so you should all be able to see my iPad now. And the first thing that I'll do is I'll go and come into the iForm app. And at this point, I've already logged in. But if I hadn't logged in, I'd tap the gear icon and then place my username and my password, and then click the sync and login button.
Hey Barrett, and while you're going through that, another great question coming through the chat here. Is there a max number of subforms that can be linked to a single parent form?
Not that I'm aware of. And the reason that we don't have a definitive amount is because your subform may look very different from my subform. And so you may have 50 questions in yours, I may only have 2. So it's hard to really quantify what the limit is for that. We have found that a lot of groups will have a parent form with a subform, so a child form attached, and then they'll have a subform attached to that subform, so a grandchild form, and it can get very linear that way. And that works out wonderfully for certain projects and for certain groups. With that, the reason we suggest having all these subforms instead of having all those questions on one level is for that upload speed, as I mentioned. And the way that the upload speed works is one table at a time. And essentially, a table is a form. So if you have 20 different subforms, it's going to go one at a time. And so it'll sync a lot faster than if you had all those questions on the parent form. And thanks again for that question. So the first thing that I want to mention here is that when you initially log in, you'll see all the forms that you've been given view rights for. If you're not sure how to do the different permissions, we do have other sessions that go through that. As a form builder, it's important that you keep in mind that every single form that you create is automatically going to be assigned to your username. So earlier, I started a form called iFormBuilder 101 May webinar demo, and you'll see that it's already appeared here. I didn't have to assign it, and that was because it's just I was the one creating it. once I'm in here, and you'll see that I can actually have different colors around the border of each form. And that's one of the best practices that I have listed over here, because this allows the user to quickly identify and find forms that apply to their particular project. And I've listed all the details on how to customize those different color schemes. So if you're interested in that later, be sure to check out the PDF. But going back into the form builder, I want to go through some of the different input types that we have available for you so that I can show you how the subform appears and how it functions as well. So the first thing I'm going to go into is a form called demo forms. And as you'll see, I actually have 5 different subforms attached to this parent form. So the parent form is this demo forms, and each one of these is its own separate subform. If I go into the iFormBuilder input types, this is going to launch my subform so that I can start creating a brand new record. And in this particular subform, I have all the different input types that iForm offers. So we allow you to have the attachment widget, which, whoops, I guess I didn't have the correct URL in there, so I'll have to go back and update that. But we also have the assign to, which allows you to assign a record to another user. So let me go back here and just open up this other form because I know that it's in here. And if you're wondering why it's launching a map, it's because I've attached the Esri widget, and that you're able to actually connect to an Esri app. So for those of you who may be using Esri as GIS services, then you may want to consider using the Esri widget and adding that functionality to your form. But just going back to this particular form, I'm going to go down here, and in this form I have a subform, which if I tap the subform button, it'll bring me to a form that was created called New to iForm. And this has the different attachments so that they can come in here and actually view a video on how to use the iForm app. In this, I also have another subform. So currently we're in the child form, and now we're going to go in the grandchild form, which allows us to take photos. Now you don't have to have the image widget in the form to be able to take photos. This is just a great use case of subforms for that functionality. Now I'll come back to that form or my device in just a second. I just want to continue through some of our best practices. The first one is to make sure you always have a device handy while you're building your forms. So you'll notice I had my iPad that I quickly brought up. The reason you always want to have a device handy is if you start adding smart controls to your form, you want to make sure that it's all working properly, and you want to test your device test your form on your device all the time. And so that's why I suggest having 1 or 2 devices near you so that as you go through it, you can make sure everything is working and functioning properly. The next best practice I have is for those of you who are starting to really create more dynamic forms and you're using your smart controls, then you'll probably want to open multiple browser windows so that if you do need to copy a table name from one form and paste it into your other form, you're eliminating the amount of error that you could have when you're creating these smart controls. So that's why for every form that I'm working on that's part of a process, I usually have a window open for each part of that, or each form for each part of that process. The next tip here really isn't a best practice, but it's just as a reminder that, as I mentioned, every form that you create is automatically assigned to your username. So you may want to unassign any of the subforms you create so you have the same user experience and can really see how it will appear for your end users. Going forward, we have to limit the amount of elements that you have on that parent form. We already talked about that. The next is to add a description to fields with longer, more in-depth directions. Now the reason I mention this, and I'll bring back my device here, is we have in the quick demo form that I started for you just moments before we started our session, I just added 1 question to my form. And if we go in there, the question is, Sally sells seashells by the seashore, but if Sally sells shells by the seashore, then where are all the seashells Sally sells? So that's a longer question, as you can see. And if I were to tap the field where I'm supposed to give that response, if I didn't have the directions listed here, then it could be kind of hard for the user to know how to respond to that question without having to go back to review that question again. So this next best practice is to add a description to fields with longer, more in-depth directions so that they appear below and that the user can quickly identify how they're supposed to respond. So within the form builder, and I'll save the changes here, we have the area for the description up in the comments section, and that's where I just copied and pasted exactly what I had in the label and pasted it in the description so that the user could see it on their device right here. And we'll be going more into the form builder in just a minute, but I wanted to show you exactly what I was mentioning, or what I wanted to show you exactly where that description was.
Hey, Barrett, another question came through here. Sorry to interrupt you, but another great question on the chat. So can the form builder compress the view of all the fields on the form so that so somebody with 100-question form can be displayed on as few pages as possible?
So what you do, I mean, it's not so much of compressing, but you'd actually be able to use smart controls to try to limit how many fields they're actually seeing, but all of those fields will still be active within the form. And so at this time, there's no way to try to fully compress it, but there is a lot that our team has done to make the file size as small as possible. And what you do have to be wary of when you are uploading forms is if you're allowing the users to take images and take photos, then you want to be aware how many photos you think they might take. And when you go into the different preferences that you can set up on the device, you'll want to change the file size of those images for faster upload. So the next, second to last best practice that we have is to include directions to users when you're creating a unique workflow. So what iFormBuilder allows you to do with the smart controls is really create a very dynamic experience. So based off of what user selections are made in a form, you'll change what they see in the form itself. And with the unique workflows, there's one in particular that I find usually calls for additional directions for the users. And that's when you use subform batch mode, which is an element reference ID, and actually changes how the subform appears. Now, for those of you who are brand new to form building, I'll show you in a second what the subform batch mode does, but do not pay too much attention to it right now. Just keep in mind that every time you are creating a unique workflow, give your users some extra directions. And the last best practice is to make sure that you follow the iFormBuilder golden rules. And here we have them. The first one is to make sure that you always test your form before going live. Sounds simple enough, but we've seen in multiple occasions where people have created forms and didn't test them in its entirety and deployed them to their users, and then their users weren't able to collect data because the form wasn't functioning properly and they didn't actually test the whole thing. So make sure that you test more than once, of course, but also test on different device types. So if your users are going to have both Android and iOS, make sure you test on both of those. But also if they're going to be using just iOS, try testing on 2 different iOS devices to make sure everything's still functioning the same. It's just a quick way to troubleshoot if any JavaScript was cached, if you have a lot of JavaScript in your forms. The second form building golden rule, and one of the more important ones, is you need to make sure that you are always using unique data column names that are database friendly. To show you what that appears as, I'm going to come into the form that we're working on now, and I'm going to create a new field so that Sally can actually capture where she's collecting all these seashells. So I'll add a new input at the bottom, And for the label, I'll call this location. Sounds perfect. So if I go to try to save my form, I now receive this error message telling me that the data column named location is not allowed. All right, sounds fine. I'll come in here, add a new input, and make sure I don't use location as the label or as the data column name. I can use location as my label and uncheck where it says based on label below that and change my data column name to be GPS_location. That is a term that's database friendly. If I were to try to save my form, I still receive the same error message. So this error message is actually on a loop. And so what's going to happen is every time I try to save my form, I'm still going to receive this error message. So what I need to do is just load the Form Builder homepage again. Come in here and select the form I was just working on. And I'll notice the second one is still there. And if I were to try to add something else and save my form, then it'll all still work. But every time you receive that error message about the data column name, you will need to reload the windows. So just remember that because it can be rather annoying. If you're looking to find the list of all the terms that can't be used, this is from our help desk article. And if you scroll through it, you'll be able to see there's a large list here. And these terms are terms that usually are usually already found in databases. So that's why you can't use them in your data column name, as well as they could be a part of JavaScript. So that's another reason why. The third form building golden rule, and the one that I hope that you remember after today is, and it's imperative that you do not change the input type, the data size, or the encryption of an element on a live form because it will delete the data. So I'll repeat that. Do not change the input type, the data size, or the encryption of an element because it will delete the data. And this is just on a live form. So if you already have been using this form for, let's say, a month and a half now, if I were to come in here and want to make a change, if I wanted to change the input type, the data size, or the encryption, I can do that, but I have to instead add a new field for that change and disable the old field so that I don't lose anything that was previously collected. So just to walk you through how this appears, we've just added the location field to our form, or this label called location. Now, within iFormBuilder, we have an input type called location where the user can actually capture their GPS coordinates. And that would be a much better use case than having the person type in their location. So what I'll do is I don't want to delete any of the data that was previously collected. So I'll duplicate that input and go back to the original one that I had, go into the input properties and uncheck or check the box that says disabled. What that's going to do is now that field will no longer be downloaded to the user's device, but it will hold on to all of the data that was previously collected, and it'll still be in the table that you have for this particular form. Now with the new field that I just duplicated, I can go in and I can change that data column name to be GPS_location1, so it has the same type of naming convention that the previous one did, just with one at the end. And I can update the label so it says exactly the same thing. And then if I go to the input properties, I'll select the location input type, and voila, there I have it.
So Barrett, while you're going through the data column name, we had a question come in. A user is experiencing that they have the same data column name on a table, and is there a reason why the iFormBuilder platform allows this to happen? She said she notices until copying the table form and getting the message, there's no other way to identify the repeated data column name other than checking one by one on the whole form. Is there a way to make this easier in case this happens again, or is this a functionality in the platform as it exists now?
Great question. So right now, if you are, one thing I should take a step back. So for those of you who are brand new, each data column name that you have in a form must be unique. And so if you were to have a data column name that was the same. So if I were to duplicate this input again and then come back and change this so that it says GPS location 1, which is the field that I have above, and I would try to save, that's when I'll receive the error message that it already exists. So unfortunately for that individual, the only way to know that a data column name already exists is by trying to save the form. So what I've gone in the habit is almost every single time I add a field or every other time I add a field, I always try to save it so then I'm able to quickly see if there was an error. Again, I still continue to see that error message because I have to reload and then reopen the form. So every time you see those error messages, they're going to stay there until you reload that window. So when it comes to building out your form, we started where we had that edit form properties page, and that's where we changed the table name to match our naming convention. The description is actually available to the user on their device. So when you type in the description in that field, depending on, on both Android and iOS, they'll see what that form's about based off of what you've typed in that description. But what's great is on iOS devices, you can also include a hyperlink. So if I open up my device again here, and I tap this little I button, so our info button, I'm then able to quickly see what that form's about, and because this is iOS, I can tap the hyperlink and it'll bring me to that web page. I can also use phone numbers and email addresses within these details. Again, on iOS devices, it will launch either the email client or the phone client so that they can have support right away. That's usually what I'll use the detail section for, is the description area for, is to really assist the users and give them additional support, not only to tell them what the form's about, but where they can receive more support on their project if they need it. I mapped out what some of the other fields are in the Edit Form Properties page, and feel free to review this later on. But what I wanted to suggest and make sure I told you about is our Reference ID 2 section. And this is where you're able to configure how the table appears when you're in the iForm app and you're looking at the list view. So if I jump back again to my iForm, if I open up this October form, if I click on the list view, I have 3 different fields that are being displayed in this table, and I can configure what 3 fields are being displayed and how they're being displayed. If I want them to be sorted in a specific order, then that's where I'll use Reference ID 2. I always want to mention this to people during the Form Builder 101 because it is really helpful to be able to configure that table, especially if you're going to be dispatching records to users. To find out exactly if you're going to use the Reference ID 2, if I go back to this page, if I go to Reference ID 2 and type in display field, and then equals, if I just put the number 1, then that's only going to have 1 field being displayed within this table. And if you're wondering where I got that number 1 from, if I highlight one of the fields that I have in my form and I go to the info section, this is where I'll see the element index number. And that's what I'll be using for the display field function to occur in my form. So moving forward, I've mapped out again what each section is with the build when you're building a new form. And to start, this common section is where we have the label, so what the user is going to see on their device, and then underneath that is the data column name, which is what we need to make sure is database friendly. And then we have the description field, which on either text or number or some of the masking widgets, this description field will appear to the user on their device. So that's where I was able to see that longer question of Sally sells seashells. If I continue in the element properties of this form, in the input properties section, we have the input type, and this is all of the different types of inputs that we have for your form. Now, if you hover over any of these, they'll give you a quick description on how to use them. But what I find extremely valuable is I've created this table, which has a list of all the different input types available within the form builder. And as I'm building out new projects, I always take a look at this to make sure that I am using the best input type for that type of question. So the range widget, if you're trying to ask the user to select a number between 1 and 10, instead of putting in JavaScript for them to only choose numbers between 1 and 10, instead use the range widget, so you have 0 on one end and 10 on the other. So make sure you're using the input types to create a better user experience and a better data collection purpose for your project. The last two things that I want to make sure that I show you, and I do have some additional material that I'll be sending along to you, but just for time, I want to make sure that you are aware on how to do these, is the first one is our adding an option list to our form. So if I want to ask the user how many seashells or what type of seashells were collected, I'll first just add in the label. I can phrase it as a question or seashells collected, either way. I'll go to my input properties and I can select we have four different types of option list. We have what we call a select option list, a pick list, and a multi-select. And here are the three examples that we have on the select, the pick list, and the multi-select. The fourth type of option list we have is for the email widget. So if you're using an email widget and you want to display the different email domains to the users, then you can actually create an option list and attach it to the email widget. But for today's purposes, we're going to use the pick list. And the reason I'm going to use the pick list is because I'm assuming right now that I'm going to have more than just a few options for the seashells. If I had a lot of options, if I had only 2 or 3, then I would use the select, but because I want to have 4 or 5 or even longer than that, I want to use the pick list. If I want them to be able to choose multiple types of seashells, then I'll choose the multi-select. If I want to make sure that this field is required, so they can't submit this form unless they fill out this area, I check off the required button, and then I'll go into the option list and into the option list manager. To create a new option list, I just click the plus button, and then once I do that, a pound sign appears. It says my option list. I'll change this to say seashells, and I'll just do seashell. I'll just do C1, C2, C3, and so on. So just to give you an idea on how this would function. Now, if at any point I want the user to see the same name, but I want it to, but they actually won't see it at the same time, then I'll need to make sure the key value is unique. So these key values can be edited at any time, and this was done by going into the advanced section of our option list manager. Another reason you may want to update the key values is if you're posting this data to another database and you want to make sure that it matches what's currently in there, then you'll change these key values to do just that. If you want to add images to your option list, then that's done through the icons URL section here. Once I've added the once I've added all the different options, I'm going to save the list, and I'm still not done here because the next thing I need to do is I need to select that option list from the right-hand column or the left-hand column, I'm sorry. And then once I do that, I'll assign this specific one to my form. And here we go. So seashells and assign list to element. Now, if I've started to collect data and then I've realized that I want to add more options to this list, I can do that, but best practice is to always add those options at the very, very bottom of the form. And the last piece here that I want to make sure that you are familiar with doing is adding subforms. So if I want to add a new subform underneath my seashells collected field, I'll add a new input, and I'll tell the user to take photos of seashells.
Yeah, Barrett, this is great. I did have a question coming in on how you do set up a subform for the user to complete multiple records. So for the person that needs to answer this question, I mean, this is a great time to see how we walk through this.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Yeah, so right now I've added the input type. I've added the label. I've added, if I needed to change that data column name, I could, but I know that's database friendly. So then I've gone into the input type, selected subform, and then the next step is going into the smart paging. So when I go into the smart paging, I'll now see a list of all the forms that I have within my account. If I hadn't created a form yet that I want to use for the subform, that would be the first step. And I would actually close this window and then open another window to create that whole form, and then come back here to see that new form in this list. So I've actually created multiple subforms for photos, and so I'm just going to choose one of those and assign it. Now, if I were to just come here and click the Save button, then the user would only be allowed to take one photo. Because I want to make sure that they're taking multiple photos, I'll go into the link mode, and from there's a drop-down list for either single or multiple. By selecting multiple, they'll be able to take as many photos as they need. And all I'll do is hit the Save button here. And that's how you add a subform. Now we're getting down to the wire here on our time for this webinar. So as I mentioned, we do have in the PDF I'm sending over, I go through some of the option list facts and some additional information on the subforms. We also have element reference IDs, so be sure to check these out, especially if you're using a lot of subforms. Subform batch mode can be extremely helpful for the user experience when they are completing a subform record. The last thing that I want to mention to you and that we have on our agenda is that we actually have a new form builder coming out. So today, as we went through our form builder, hopefully you have you're starting to feel a bit more confident with how the form builder is used and how it appears. But we have a new one coming out that looks a little bit different, but has the same idea and premise behind it. So to jump in there to quickly give you a sneak peek, let's see if I come back here. I may need to reload this window, so just bear with me.
So Barrett, as you're doing that, when the new form builder does come out, will the user need to, can they start using it right away, or do they need to use kind of a hybrid of the older or the current version?
Great question, Kevin. So as you see in this specific environment that I logged into, if I go under the Forms tab, I see the Form Builder. So that's where we can say the classic version of the Form Builder will still be accessible. And then we'll have a new area where you can go to use the Form Builder 2.0. Now with that, we're going to have both versions and supporting both versions for about another year, but then we are going to push everyone to just use the new version, Form Builder 2.0 instead, because I think you'll like it a lot better, or hopefully you will, but then at that point it'll be easier just to maintain the one. But we will give you a grace period where you'll have both available to use. So already you'll probably notice that this form builder is different. When you come in here, you're able to see the label as well as the table name. And that, again, the naming convention is still really helpful here for your table name, but because you're going to be able to find the labels, it may be a little bit easier to find what you're looking for. You can also search for specific forms, and you can customize how this table appears. So if I want to see the description for the form, then I can see that as well. And just by clicking on one of these names, it brings us into the new interface. And on the left-hand side, I have a list of all the different fields that we have. And on the right-hand side, all those input properties that we were just going through on the drop-down list. In here, it's really nice because you can change how the view that you have in your workspace. So if I want to have it so that both of those panels are on the left-hand side. I can tether between the two. I can even change what device I'm looking at for this. So if I'm using an iPhone, I can see how that, or an iPad, I can see how that appears as well. And I can go into what we call a table view. So this is all the different questions that I have in my form, and I'm able to actually customize it in this table. I can copy, cut, and paste some of the different questions as well. So this new form builder is designed to accelerate your workflow completely. Another new updated feature that we have is you can go between the forms and option lists. So currently when you're building out a form, you have to go in and select one of those option list types and then assign that option list to your form. And if you have to go and edit any of those option lists, you have to go through that same process. So this allows you to come in and make edits to your option lists or create new option lists really, really quickly and expedite your process completely. So that was just a sneak peek, and we will be going through more of that later on. Just to close out, in case some people have to head out, I will stick around for some additional questions. But just a reminder, in the next 48 hours, we'll send out a recording of the session, a PDF to go along with it, as well as a form package that I'll give you directions on how to import that form package into your account so that you can see the different input properties available to you when you're building your forms. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for your time today and your effort. We know you have other things to do with your day, but we really appreciate that you chose to spend it here with us. So enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, and you'll be hearing from us soon. Thank you.